Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Good evening.
Shall we begin?
Yes.
Thank you for joining us tonight for our 1517th lecture. I'm Matt Van Valkenburg, Secretary of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. On behalf of the officers and council, I welcome you to our lecture. By way of reminder, lecture content does not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their continuing support. We are especially thankful to Ms. Lee Jung-uk, who has made the use of this space at Fast 5 possible. A couple of announcements. I should note that membership fees are set to go up in the near future. So if you're going to renew, you might want to do that sooner than later. And on September 11th, we will be featuring a lecture by Kim Il-ho, who is a North Korean defector. And so he's going to speak about his experiences, but he's also requested that the lecture not be filmed or videoed. So if you want to see that, you'll have to be here in person. So tonight we are joined by Brother Anthony. Brother Anthony, a British-born member of the community of Taizé in France, came to Korea in 1980 and is Emeritus Professor of English Literature at Sogang University. He has published many translations of modern Korean poetry and fiction and is President Emeritus of RAS Korea. He is preparing an annotated English translation of Dalé's history, having recently published English translations of the Latin letters of Saint Kim Dae-gong and Chae Yang-up. Tonight, he will examine the dramatic events of 1866 in Korea. After the lecture, there will be time for questions. Please welcome Brother Anthony.
How does this work? Okay, can you hear me? Good. Yes, I'll try to speak clearly. Well, most of you might remember 1866. It was a memorable year, a little bit long ago. And so several different things happened. And so tonight, this is sort of really a kind of survey or reminder of some of the things that happened mostly in Korea in 1866. So first of all, some background. 1866 wasn't exactly the beginning of everything. If you want a beginning of lots of the things that happened, it would be the Opium War. Now, of course, there were two Opium Wars, one Britain against China, and then the Second Opium War included France as well as Britain. And the Second Opium War really ended in 1860, so a few years before 66. And the way the Second Opium War ended was very troubling for Korea. Korea had been always in a tributary relationship with China, and to see China humiliated and the Western powers imposing their will on it, dividing it up into areas of influence and so on. This could not help but upset the Koreans, for whom China was the center. For example, you see, at the end of the Second Opium War, there were some very unpleasant things. China refused to take seriously diplomatic negotiations. And at a given point when things seemed to be settled, China arrested, tortured, and killed several members of an official Western delegation. And this, of course, upset the Westerners considerably, and they decided to give China a lesson. China had no hope of dominating France and England militarily. They had come up to the walls of Peking. They had decided not to go into Peking because that would be very messy. But outside of Peking was the Summer Palace, the Imperial Summer Palace, which was full of antiques and treasures of all kinds. It was a living residence for the emperor. And in October, then, the Anglo-French troops began looting the Summer Palace. And then on the 18th of October, mainly the British soldiers set fire to it to punish the emperor, essentially, for his stubbornness. And it took 2 days before the fire was out. So that the end of the war was a treaty, the Treaty of Tianjin, various treaties that were forced from 1858 onwards. China was forced to sign them. But then after this, the treaties were only finally ratified in October 1860 when everything was over. And all these treaties were very humiliating for China, terrifying for Joseon, for Korea, that had no wish to welcome any kind of Western outsiders or to change anything in all the traditional relationships. And the treaties opened the Chinese ports to foreign trade, permitted foreign legations in Peking, in the Chinese capital, allowed Christian missionary activity, allowed Chinese to become Christians, and in fact legalized the import of opium that the Chinese had opposed, that had been the beginning of the Opium War. And very important, at the same time, there was a kind of sideline that the Russians came in. There was a very, very savvy Russian diplomat around. Of course, the Russians were not involved in the Opium War, but this diplomat sort of pushed the Chinese to turn to the Russians, and the Russians, he said, would be happy to help China against England and France if China would hand over to Russia what is now known as Outer Manchuria, to the north and east of Manchuria. And this is a total of 400,000 square kilometers of land. And so Russia, by taking this land, and China had no idea what the land was like. They had no maps. The Chinese had no modern maps. Nobody had ever been there. For them, it was sort of wasteland up there beyond. And the Russians knew very well what was there. So at the same time, part of this agreement was that, you see, the Korean frontier with Manchuria was by the Yalugang and then the Tumen River. To the east was the Tumen River. And by this change of belonging, the frontier along the Tumen River toward the mouth of the Tumen River was no longer part of China, it became part of Russia. Russian territory came right down to the last few dozen miles of the Tumen River, giving Russia a direct frontier with Korea, as well as cutting off China from direct access to the East Sea. But the most important thing was that now Russia was a direct neighbor with Korea. And this horrified the Koreans when they realized it. And it took a few years for the Koreans to realize it. Under the old system, the Chinese and the Koreans had agreed that north of the frontier with Korea, there would be nobody. It would be a no man's land, quite a huge area all the way up to prevent incidents between Koreans and Manchurians or Chinese. So under that agreement, the whole area north of the border was empty. But the Russians wanted to bring in as many settlers as possible to occupy the land, to make it clear it was their land. But there weren't enough Russians interested in going to this very, very hostile land. And there were Koreans, especially in the northeastern part of Korea, who were very happy to be able to move into what had been Manchuria, what was now Russia, and start farming, however difficult. So that was the most important aspect, perhaps, of this in what followed. And it only happened, Koreans only slowly realized what was going on. And when the Chinese later realized what they had given away, the size of the territory, when they got some modern maps of Russian East and Siberia, they were horrified and tried to get it back. And the Russians said, no, you signed it. It's ours. So tough on you. And the Russians actively encouraged Koreans to come in. Now, the emperor in China, you had the Changfeng emperor, who was only 19 when he came to the throne in 1850. And as soon as he became emperor, you had this huge Taiping rebellion, which broke out in southern China, which was a terrible incident. And at the same time, there were other rebellions in the north, in the west, and in the south. And by the end of all this trouble, tens of millions of people had died. And as the British and French approached Peking in 1860, the emperor fled. And the next year, he was in a kind of residence away from several hundred miles away from Beijing. He died in 1861, only age 30. His health ruined, as they say, by debauchery, drugs, and alcohol. He wasn't very happy. And he was succeeded then by his son, who was 6. And that he was given the name the Tongji Emperor. And because he's only 6, and rule would be by regents. And there were 2 dowagers, wives of the emperor, of the dead emperor, Shishi and Qian, as well as his brother. And they took power. They got rid of the regents, they killed a few. And Chichi was actually only a concubine, the second wife, but she was the mother of the new emperor, whereas Xian had been the official empress, and she supported Chichi. So the 2 of them became sort of supreme rulers, but Chichi was the main real power. And she really ruled China until she died in 1908. Xian supported her. And then in 1875, this young new emperor, he died only 18, and he had no heir. She then nominated her nephew to become the new emperor, and she retained power during his rule. He was still only a child, and she probably finally poisoned him just before she died. Now, in Korea, you had similar problems. In 1834, King Hanjong became king. He was age 7 when his father died. And his grandmother, in Sunwon, served then as regent. His father had been the crown prince. His father had never been king. And his father had died, and so the father's son had become the king. The dead king was his grandfather. And Hanjong's mother was Queen Shinjong, another queen, so you had all these queens around. But then Hanjong, he died only 15 years later, without having a child, without an heir, in 49. And So King Chulchong, who had been king then, we were going to jump him over him, but when he died in 1864, the queens had a big problem because there were no heirs, there was no obvious person to take over power. And finally, they turned to a son, a cousin of a former king of Hongzhou. And this Yi Wanbom, the prince by title, but he was living happily as a poor peasant in Ganghwa Island with no education and no expectations of anything. And they suddenly sent a huge procession that said, "You are our king." And he was very dirty. He was eating a watermelon with his hands. He had juice all over him when they arrived. So in fact, although he did become king and he had some influence, actually it was the queens, his regents, who continued in power. They were all from the Andong King clan. So then Chulchong, one important thing about Chulchong, his ancestors, the reason why he was in Ganghwa in exile was because some of his ancestors had been Catholic. And Chulchong had experienced real rural poverty in Ganghwa. So he had tremendous sympathy for the very poor commoners and for the Catholic Church. So while Chulchong was king, there was virtually no trouble for Catholics in Korea, although it was illegal and there had been fierce persecutions before. But then, because he had a wild kind of life, he indulged himself as king, drinking and eating everything or whatever. So he died, only 32 years old, again, without an heir. And Queen Chorin, as he lay dying, was in the palace holding the royal seal, which was necessary for the succession for stamping documents. And Queen Xinzhong grabbed it, snatched it from her, saying, "That's mine, I'm older than you are." And actually they agreed that the only possible heir and future king would have to be the son, Yi Jae-hwan, the son, second son actually, of Yi Ha-eung, who had been a ninth generation descendant of King Injo, of all things. So it's very obscure, very obscure. And it was agreed then that the Queen Xinzhong would act as regent until he grew up. However, this boy, he was only 12 at the time. His father, it was his father who really manipulated them to appoint him as king. His father then was immediately promoted to be Prince Hung Sun Daewon Gun. So although he was not officially regent, the regent was the queen, the former queen. But she asked him immediately to help his son govern, I mean, help her. But we're going to see this at the end. After 1866, the Taewon-gun took virtually complete control of Korea. No legal basis for that until finally, when everything was in a very bad state, the king that we call Kojong took control. Well, we call him Kojong, but of course, the name Kojong was only given to him after he died. All the kings' names that we use are temple names, they're names after they died. When he was king, he had no name. He was the king. So in 1866, we have an emperor in China aged 10 and a king in Joseon aged 14. And in both countries, effective power was in the hands of women. So the events of 1866 that I want to take you through, first of all, the big persecution of Catholics Pyongyang is the name of 1866 in the Chinese system. And after that persecution, when 9 French missionaries were executed, the French, hearing about this, prepared a response in the autumn. Then in the summer, Ernst Oppert, a German merchant from China, made a second visit to Korea, sailed up the Han River. And at the same time, in the summer of the same year, the General Sherman, an American ship from China, sailed up toward Pyongyang, went aground, and there was a quarrel, and all the people on board the ship were massacred. Then, 1866, the king, still only 14, was married. And his marriage depended on his father proving a good bride, not a love match. But then China had to send an ambassador to bring the Chinese emperor's nomination of this bride as the new Queen of Korea, because that was something that the Chinese emperor had to do. So in the autumn, then, the French came and occupied Ganghwa Island, and then they withdrew. So the Catholics in Korea, the story of the Catholics in Korea really begins in 1784, when a young man, a young yangban, Yi Seung-hun, accompanied his father to Beijing. His father was part of an annual embassy from Korea, and this young man met a Catholic priest at the cathedral in Beijing, talked to him using writing Chinese characters, and the priest taught him about Catholicism. And he said, "Oh, yes, I like that. So the priest, "Would you like to be baptized?" "Oh, yes, please." So in 1874, Yi Seung-hun was baptized in Beijing, and they explained to him that now he'd been baptized, he could baptize anybody else who wanted to be a Catholic in Korea. So they sent him back to Korea as a kind of missionary, but they had very little knowledge. They gave him lots of books. And after a little bit of discussion with his friends in Korea, they all said, "Yes, we want this." And he began to baptize them, and they baptized others. But it was not only high-class Yangban men who were being baptized, but from the very start, there were low-class men and women, children, servants. And the idea was that since God is the Father of all are equally children of God. We are all equally brothers and sisters. There was this very radical social transformation in the early Catholic Church in Korea. So it grew without any foreign missionaries. And from the start, Confucian scholars, both in China and in Korea, denounced what they called the pernicious doctrine, especially because Catholics were not allowed to make ancestral offerings or perform offerings to Confucius, for example. And early on in the 1790s, a few were executed. Then, in 1801, the enlightened King Zhongzhou, who had been quite tolerant of the Catholics in his court, died suddenly. And there was a fierce persecution because on the side of the regent, who was from Yandong Kim, there were also people who were very hostile to the Catholic teaching. And hundreds of Koreans, Catholics, died. Others, of course, gave up the faith, denied the faith, apostatized, as they say. Then, in 1839, another persecution arose, for some reason, not quite clear why, and 3 French missionaries who had just entered only a few years, 2-3 years before, were executed. And from 1845 on, more French missionaries begin to come in. So when we get to January 1866, there were perhaps 10,000 or maybe more Catholics in Korea, 2 French bishops, 10 French priests. But very soon, only 3 priests were left alive in hiding, and they fled to China. while thousands, nobody knows how many, thousands of Korean Christians were executed. So these are the priests from France who were martyred. It all began, according to the missionaries, it began in January of 1866, when they say a Russian vessel presented itself at Wonsan demanding to trade. Now, there's no trace of this in government records, but we do know that by this time, Korea was very worried about the Russians being up there and threatening to come down into Korea. Anyway, the government was troubled about the Russians, and some rather foolish Christians around the court decided to suggest to the Daedong River that he should ask the French bishop, Bishop Bernays, for help from the French against the Russians, because they really thought that if the Daedong River was grateful to the French against the Russians, this would help authorize Catholicism, bring them freedom. A letter was presented to him and he ignored it. And the bishops had even come back to Seoul. They were expecting to meet him. And then another letter was prepared by a higher official, very special man, Nam Jong-sam. His father was also a very senior scholar, long been a Christian. They're both Christians. But of course, this all drew attention to the presence of the bishop and of the family, the Christians in the court in central positions. So then there was, you can see in the government records, a campaign in the court demanding the arrest of Nam Jong-sam. And he fled, then felt ashamed and came back. His father was arrested, he died in prison. Nam Jong-sam was executed, he's now a saint. So by the start of the Lunar New Year, February 15th, 1866, government records also say that these two guys, Chang Un and Che Hyung, had also been arrested, and they were in charge of the church's printing press. By this time, the church had become free enough to have quite a large printing press for its books. So on February the 23rd, Bishop Bernays was arrested, and with his Korean assistant, other priests, Father Bretonnier, Beaulieu, Dolhy, were arrested, interrogated, February 26th, February 27th, and on March the 8th, they were executed. But they were foreigners. Foreigners were special. You didn't easily execute foreigners. Most people, if they were executed officially, you took them out of the Sosamun and you cut off their head quickly. But foreigners, like high-class traitors, were taken right out to the Han River, where there was a military exercise ground in Senamto. And there you had a gathering of several hundred military soldiers, and they were executed in the full ritual of military execution, with a whole group of soldiers holding spears, holding swords, dancing around them, each one hacking at their neck until at last the head fell off, if you were lucky. And then another two, Father Potier and Nicholas, were arrested in March, and they were executed already on March 11th. And then finally, the second bishop, Bishop Davalui, my hero, I like him, was arrested. He was in the provinces with two other priests, Father Omet. And they were taken to Seoul, but then at this time there was the question of the king's marriage, and also the king was sick with smallpox. And they said, no more executions in Seoul, it's bad luck. So they take these three priests all the way down to the south, to the west coast. And they are executed, they're taken to this place. And suddenly the bishop realized that the next day was going to be Good Friday. And the guards wanted to exhibit them around the region. He said, no, we must die tomorrow. It's Good Friday, we must die on Good Friday. And he said, okay. And they were executed. But Bishop Davalui had a hard time because he was the first one, he was bishop. And the executioner took one swipe, his head was sort of half off. and he's lying on the ground, and the executioner said, "I haven't been paid. I need to be paid. How much am I getting?" And this is from the local authorities. And so they weren't prepared to negotiate. So it took a long time to work this out between the executioner and the local government. And finally, they chopped off his head and the other two heads. But he had a hard time. Poor Father Dowry. That's down in Hemi, near Hemi in Solme on the west coast. So that left these three, Father Riedel, Ferron, Calais, and they were hiding in the countryside toward the west coast. First separate, they didn't know that the others were free. They thought everybody had gone. Finally, they got in touch with each other, and Father Riedel was sent to China on a small ship, first of all, to go ahead. And he reported then the death of the 9 French to the French authorities in Beijing and to the French fleet that was stationed around Shanghai. And Admiral Rose, who was in charge of the French fleet, he had quite a lot of power. He was very indignant. They must be punished. And he set out an expedition later in the year. The other 2 priests only sailed across later. And this was then the beginning of the French expedition to an expression of French religious patronage in China and the surrounding area. We, the French, protect the Catholic Church. So Father Riedel sailed across, tiny boat, very lucky. He arrived in Jefu July 7th. And on July 10th, we have documents. Admiral Rose came back to Tenzing, and arriving back, I found a French missionary. Father Riedel just arrived from Jefu. He quickly come up to join him. Some news of the killing of the 9 French missionaries was sent to the French legation in Beijing, and the man in charge, the chargé d'affaires, Henri de Bellonnet, crazy guy. He'd been in charge of things since the year before. The actual minister of France was sick. So on July 13, Bellonnet sent a very violent letter to the prince in charge of foreign affairs. The same day on which the King of Korea laid his hands upon my unhappy countrymen was the last day of his reign. He himself proclaimed its end, which I, in my turn, solemnly declare today. French ministers don't have the power to dethrone kings. Anyway, and in a few days, our military forces are to march to the conquest of Korea. Only he didn't actually have any soldiers. The only person with any force was Admiral Rose, and Admiral Rose did not like Bellonnet. Anyway, Admiral Rose first was obliged to sail to Saigon in response to troubles there. Anyway, so returning from Saigon unexpectedly soon, Rose was ready in September to sail with 3 ships to Korea. Father Riedel and some of his Korean crew went there as well as guides. And they found, luckily, how to go up the Han River. They found the entrance to the Han River and reached Ganghwa Jin, which is where the Ganghwa Taegyeok now runs, next to Chotusan, from where they could see the walls of Seoul on September 26th. They spent 1 day there and returned down the river and back to China, making the first accurate chart of the river, but not being able to talk to the authorities. Actually, on August the 17th, already the Korean government had received a warning from Peking, official warning. In a communication from the Minister of France, it said that the King of Korea having arrested 2 French bishops and 9 missionaries, as well as indigenous Christians, men and women, old and young, he put them all to death. And that's why the Minister of France has given orders to raid soldiers, warships, assemble them without delay. China is convinced that this matter can be settled justly and amicably. She made her views known to the Minister of France, asking him to consider all things carefully before deciding. So the same day, the Korean government formulated a reply saying, "We did well to kill the French. They were illegal." The French then sailed up to Ganghwa Island and sailed away again next day and back down the river. And so the Korean authorities really couldn't understand what was going on. Why had they come and why had they left? Actually, of course, there weren't enough soldiers with them. It was just a survey before they did anything. But at the same time, almost exactly just before the French, Ernst Oppert came to visit Korea in the summer. Now, there's a report in the Korean court records of a British ship that had come demanding to trade on the west coast. And they said this ship already came in the spring. So that must be the emperor ship chartered by this merchant, Ernst Oppert. Ernst Oppert had already come once. He was a freelance merchant. He had no diplomatic status. He had no position at all, no official position. But now in August, the second visit, he was able to sail all the way up the Han River as far as Seoul. He was the first Westerner to do that. And he made a rough chart, and somewhere on the journey to Seoul, some Koreans even handed him a letter from Father Riedel, who was in hiding, asking for help. But Oppert had known before he left China that by that time, Father Riedel had reached China. And then, also in the August famous incident, the General Sherman. On August the 9th, in 1866, this American-owned armed merchant schooner, General Sherman, left China, left Shifu, Yangtze, and headed for Korea, hoping to do trade, although they knew it was illegal. And there were just 2 Americans, 1 British officer, 13 Asian Chinese crew members, and a Welsh missionary, Robert Thomas, who was very eager to go to preach in Korea. And on August the 16th, the ship entered the Daedong River leading to Pyongyang. They had no idea really where they were going or what they were doing. Because it had been raining, the river was quite high. They could sail up so far. But as they sailed up, the river was sinking. There was no more rain. And finally, the ship ran aground close to Pyongyang. And a Korean government record from the 7th month, the 22nd day, has a report from the governor of Pyongyang, the province of Pyongyang, recording how a dinghy from the General Sherman had captured an official, was later rescued. And then on the 25th, there's a government order instructing the magistrate of Pyongyang to take all necessary measures. And then on the 27th, Seoul received information that the General Sherman had been set ablaze and all the people, all the crew, everybody had been massacred. Probably the crew had panicked and had opened fire on the citizens of Pyongyang who had come to look at them. This actually happened for our September the 2nd. And North Korea celebrates this as a great anti-imperialistic victory and say it was led by an ancestor of the great leader. So you've got these North Korean postage stamps celebrating the destruction of the General Sherman. As I say, the king had married in March, but preparations took time in Beijing to recognize the new bride as Queen of Korea. She, of course, being a woman, had no name. She was from the Min clan, and she was born in 1851, and she had been chosen after a lengthy process, mainly by the Daewon-gun, who had interviewed a few of the possible girls. He chose her because her parents were dead, and she came from a very little known, not very influential clan, because the Daewon-gun was obsessed with power, his power. He didn't want a powerful queen. Of course, the irony is that we all know what kind of queen this queen turned out to be. She was the main opposition right through afterwards. So there was a wedding ceremony in what we would call the 20th of March, 1866. And if you look at Wikipedia, I suppose it must be true. It says that after the ceremony, the king said bye-bye and went back to his concubine to spend the night, not with his new bride. And it was only quite a bit later that they actually consummated their marriage. Still, China had to send an envoy to Seoul to bring the emperor's patent of investiture as queen, and that took time. So the official chosen was vice president of the court, Hui Lin. He was only appointed in August, and so as he came down across into Korea, he prepared a detailed report of his journey day by day, where he was, who welcomed him, where he stayed, what he ate, everything, the weather. And this was a fairly common custom. And that was later translated into French. So I was able to read it and translate it into English. So the envoy's mission began September 20. He went to the Court of Rights to receive the imperial patent. From there he set out. He got to Uiju at the entry to Korea, October 18. In fact, just after the French had landed in Ganghwa. And here he received a formal welcome sent by the king. And they provided interpreters, carriages with drivers, and escort as required by rights. So on the 31st of October, he's about to arrive in Seoul. He's been on the road for 42 days. Slow journey. At 9 o'clock the next morning, we set out. The king came to meet the imperial order. 10 li outside the gate Yongmun, and after having carried out the ceremonies required by the rites, he took the lead and returned to the city. The second envoy and I entered the outer city through Sinnimun, Namdaemun. Then, heading east, we arrived outside the Jinseonmun Gate, which is the Changdong, and we got off our sedan chairs and entered the Injeongja, the big throne room in Changdong. And the king, wearing his costume with dragons, came out to meet us. I mean, the king is only 15, just past 50, 50th birthday. He saluted the imperial order, which he read aloud. The ceremony was accompanied by the salute of the 3 kneelings and the 9 prostrations. The foreign guests were then seated in the west. The master was seated opposite in the east. The king had appointed 3 interpreters who passed on his questions according to the ancient rites which regulate the reception of guests. The king asked about the health of his imperial majesty, the 2 empresses. I stood up and turning to the left, answered. And in the evening, we slept in the Nambyolgo, that's to say Chosun Hotel. Well, now it's Chosun Hotel. That day, the father of the king, the Daewon-gun, brought me 2 of his nephews and his 2 sons-in-law, and his son also came to see me with some members of the academy. We conversed with the help of the brush, did not separate until 4 in the morning. They were drinking. So the next day, festivities continued. The king came in person to visit me. The banquet, similar to that of the day before, being prepared. We were very polite to each other. And according to the custom, I received presents from him. I had brought with me 8 different kinds of Chinese products, which I sent to the king. And in the evening, the king returned my politeness by sending me products of Korea, 12 different kinds, which I refused at first, then which I ended up accepting on his repeated requests. This Nambyol-gung was actually replaced by the Temple of Heaven that's in the garden of Joseon Hotel later in the 1890s. So on the 3rd of November, the envoy, after only a couple of days, set out on his return journey. And probably he heard nothing about the French expedition during his visit. And of course, he did not see the Queen. Women were not visible. So the king had arranged for emblem bearers, musicians in a vacant lot outside the western gate. Yong-eun-mun, a snack was set up there on tables opposite each other on both sides of the road. We were very polite there. 2 hours of spent in conversation, libation. Could not decide to separate. Finally, the king and the others came, offer me wine, wish me a happy journey, expressing their regrets to see me leave. So on 19th of December, from the 3rd of November to the 19th of December, he was traveling. He entered the palace in Beijing at 4 in the morning, got to Beijing the day before, and meets the emperor, child. I respectfully asked for news of His Majesty's health. The emperor questioned me during this audience about the affairs of Korea. I gave respectful and detailed answers on all points, returned home. So the king of Korea at that time was 15, and the emperor was about 11. Okay. So then we come to the French naval expedition in the autumn of 1866. Admiral Rose had gathered together quite a fleet, some ships, some large, some smaller, a force of 500-600 Marines from Japan and from around China. They left Sheffield on October 11 and arrived near Ganghwa Island, south of Ganghwa Island, on October the 13th. There's the names of all the ships. And on October the 14th, because they had with him Riedel and a couple of Korean shipmen who had come with Riedel, of course, they knew this area. They knew where the river was leading up to Seoul. They'd already been there anyway. So on October the 14th, Admiral Rose did 5 of the ships sailed up the Salt River, that's between Ganghwa and the mainland, the very narrow channel. And the troops landed at Cap Cochin, which is just where the old bridge to Ganghwa crosses from the mainland. The village on the island's coast from where a road leads up to Ganghwa, whatever you call it, the city of Ganghwa. And the other ships moored to the south of Yongchong Island. And Admiral Rose wrote, "My intention is to immediately seize the island of Ganghwa, which is the first stronghold of Korea, whose occupation allows me to blockade Seoul, stop the convoys of rice which are used to feed the population." It didn't happen. I mean, he landed in Ganghwa, but he never tried to block transport going up the Han River. They settled down. It's more like a picnic. And they were the people all ran away. They occupied their houses. They stole whatever they could find to feed themselves. And so on October the 15th, Capitaine Dosery led a force, several hundred men, to survey the approach to Ganghwa. There are these drawings because there was a very young officer on one of the ships who was an artist, August Ernst. And he did a whole series of drawings of the expedition, which he did not like or approve of. And these drawings were then sent to France to magazines that converted them into engravings, and they were then published with articles about the expedition. And so on October the 16th, they set out to attack the east gate of Ganghwa City and capture the township. Well, then no problem. There was nobody there. Everybody had left. All the soldiers had run away. All the population had gone streaming out west side of Ganghwa as they came up the east side. And so you've got these drawings. And August Ernst also wrote, we have texts written by Zubia. As the admiral had not taken any measure to prevent looting, indiscipline soon broke out everywhere. After taking Ganghwa, the enemy being taken by surprise, an attack on Seoul, though excessively bold, would not have been too much of a risk, but the admiral missed the opportunity. It will never come again. It is to be deplored, as there is now no serious outcome to be hoped for. August Ernst was 21 when he wrote that. He's a bright guy. But he hated the whole expedition. When he got back to China, was it China or Japan, he resigned from the Navy and became a professional artist, and a good artist. So the French took control of the government offices up by the Royal Palace in Ganghwa City, and the remains, and explored and what they found, and they sent back to France. You have a whole list of things that they sent back to France, and Koreans are very interested in this list. They would like to know where all the other things, because the only thing that has ever really been identified are the books, the several hundred books known as the Uikue, which are now back in the National Museum in Korea. But all these other objects, nobody knows where they are in France. Must be somewhere. And so they were settled down here in Gapgochin on the mainland. There was this Munsun fortress, a camp surrounded by fortifications just opposite them, a south gate close to the point where the road from Seoul arrived. And so very soon after this, the reconnaissance party landed on the mainland side, close to the south gate. And they were fired on by soldiers in hiding on top of the gate. 3 French sailors were killed. These were the only casualties. And a brief exchange of fire killed a number of Koreans. The others fled. And both sides not only reported this, you have reports on the Korean side as well as on the French side. It's interesting that the Korean report is very similar to the French report, only from the other side. 2 of the boats having landed, this guy set off alone, uttering loud cries, and then they all fired together. We found ourselves exposed to enemy fire. There were 3 deaths. So the Koreans actually reported to Seoul that they had lost 3 men, and the French also lost 3 men. And the French then set fire to the gate, to the pavilion on the gate. These are drawings that Zuber made. He liked Korea. I mean, the weather was very nice while they were there. And he felt great sympathy. Well, one day it was raining, so he loved these rain hats. But things ended badly. The French heard that there were some Korean forces hiding in Cheongdongsa Temple down in the south area of Ganghwa-do. This temple is surrounded by a fortification, by a wall with a southern gate, formal in a big gate. And the French decided to go and have a look. So they set off early in the morning with their lunch on a horse. They didn't really expect to find anybody. They thought it was empty. They were coming up toward the south gate. Nobody, total silence. And there was no gate, so it was wide open. Just as they were coming in, all the Koreans who were hiding on top of the wall started to fire at them. And the French, of course, were not prepared. Their guns weren't ready. Nothing was ready. Fortunately, the Korean bullets, instead of going zoom, used to go boom. So quite a number, about 30 of the French, were wounded in the legs and couldn't walk. Nobody was killed. Nobody got shot up there, only down on the legs. And they were ambushed. Stupid guys. Of course, they're stupid. They had no reconnaissance and so on. And the doctor, who also wrote a report about the expedition, said 36 men were hit by bullets. Nobody fatally, almost all minor. And there were 5 officers, lower limbs pierced. The enemy were up there and they were firing down. And then the Korean side sent to Seoul a much more dramatic report. In yesterday's battle, 6 enemies were killed outside the Seoul gate. Our soldiers saw them clearly with their eyes. So I noted only 6, but during the night, 4 or 5 inhabitants of the villages along the road came to bring news saying, when the defeated enemies retreated, we observed them. They went on foot, and there were more than 40 corpses in a line. They surrounded them all, loaded a certain number of packs of them to return home. We think must be at least 50 dead. Well, it's not true, but that's what they thought. That's what Seoul thought. And the Korean soldiers went on with a big problem. Our soldiers, who have just had this harsh alert and whose powder and bullets are exhausted, have only one voice: to ask for reinforcement, because if tomorrow the enemy returns with reinforced numbers, we don't know to what extremity we'll be reduced. There, no more gunpowder, no more bullets. They were terrified. But the French did not come back. Instead, Admiral Rose, overnight, decided they were leaving, with no result. And there was this big bronze bell, the south gate of Ganghwa. French used to say, oh, we'll take this back. It's very heavy. They're having a hard time transporting it. But when Rose suddenly decided, we're leaving, they had to abandon it. It was left there. So you can still see it in Ganghwa. And Father Edel, who was there as interpreter, was furious, because he knew this was pointless. They had come, they had met nobody, they had transmitted no message, and now if they were leaving like this after this incident in the temple, what amazement, what astonishment. The next day when we learned that the admiral had given the order to make preparations for departure, to burn everything in the town, to abandon the place, to return to the ships. We were dismayed. The flight was to be ending. We were defeated. France routed by Korea. And so they sailed away. And the Koreans fired at them. I mean, nobody was hurt. There you are, Admiral Rose and the crew. Tough guys. And one result of the French sailing up as far as Ganghwa, where they landed, was that this rock in Ganghwa, which is now called Cholchusan, became an execution ground. And the court records of the Korean government list a whole series of executions of Korean Catholics at Ganghwa, because there was this idea that the blood of martyrs was needed to wash away the stain of foreign footsteps. So you have the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 separate reports of executions of Catholics at Ganghwa in the days following the French withdrawal, even before the withdrawal, first one on 23rd. And then on the 24th, the regent stated that nobody should use anything foreign, anything Western. People, women, I think especially, had been importing from China Western cloth, cotton cloth, and little objects, maybe clocks or whatever. Nobody must ever use anything Western. And the barbarians, all the troubles that European barbarians have caused is because they want to do trade. So if we don't use anything made by them, they will realize that they have no prospect of trading with us. And women should burn any dresses made of foreign cloth. And then the other two French priests then sailed back to China and thought they were going to be able to join the French force on Ganghwa and return to their mission. But when they got to Ganghwa, they said, no, really, they had to go straight back. So in the aftermath, Father Edel finally, as bishop, came back to Korea in 1877, hiding for a few months. He was arrested, he was found, 1878, and expelled toward China, and he retired to France where he died. Father Blanc was the next missionary to come in, and then Father Mutel arrived, and he then became bishop, 1890, and he remained as Catholic bishop in Seoul till 1933. And the martyrs, all those dead Koreans, many of them, that first of all, 103 saints were canonized in 1984, and then 124 more were declared blessed on the way to saints in 2014. Meanwhile, the Pyongyang was seen in Korea as a great victory, and the Daewon-gun had this victory stone erected at the entrance to Cheongdong-sa. You can still see it, to celebrate the great victory of General Yang Hon-su against the French barbarians. And they erected stones around the coast. Our coasts are guarded, no foreign ships may pass. And this led, of course, in 1871 to the incident off Ganghwa Island, where the American ships were fired on because they approached, and that led to 300, 400 dead Korean soldiers. And then finally in 1875, Japan deliberately sent a ship to be fired on, and then with this to provoke a diplomatic incident to send a battleship and force Korea to sign at last the first treaty of Ganghwa with Japan. So, conclusion, two kings, a big problem for Korea that emerged at this time then. You see, until 1866, Queen Cho had been the official regent. But in that year, for some unclear reason, she announced the end of the regency. But the king was only 15, he was too young. And in that vacuum, Daewon-gun, the king's father, began to exercise all the regent's powers without having any legal basis. He was not regent by any legal process. And soon there were complaints coming in about there are two kings. Daewon-gun is issuing orders as if he were king. And the king only took power, in fact, in 1873, after there was enormous trouble because of the Daewon-gun's abuse. The Daewon-gun had announced the reconstruction of Gyeongbokgung Palace already in 1865, saying it was to restore the full dignity of the monarchy. The work began in 1867. The king moved in 1868. and to build the palace, rebuild the palace, which was in ruins from the from the Japanese War. Taxes were levied, and the total cost was 7.8 million yuan, and only 450,000 came from royal money. All the rest, more than 7 million yuan, was collected by force from the people. So by his stubborn authoritarianism, the Daewon-gun was at the heart of all the disastrous events that were to follow. And because of his faith and his submission to filial piety, the king was never able to oppose his father as he should have done. And the rest is history. Thank you.
So in another our reports in Korean, so in the 1816, the September 16, 714, October 714, and about 1,000 French soldiers. Okay, you are 500, 600, which is correct. Second, so then if Christian called the Pyongyang news in caused the extreme confusion in the Joseon society with numerous residents of Hanyang fleeing the capital city. Which is correct?
Yes, I know.
Okay.
French soldiers. Yeah,
about another report in close 1,000 soldiers. But you 500, 600.
There are about in Admiral Rose's fleet, perhaps 600.
600.
Not more. Certainly not more.
This is not correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And then the last one. This is the called the beginning of the cause extreme confusion in the Joseon society with numerous residents of Hanyang fleeing the capital city. But we please explain for detail.
Can you?
It caused confusion in Hanyang, the invasion, and I think that's the last one.
Very simple. Right? You see, the Indian caused extreme confusion in the Joseon society with numerous residents, the people of Hanyang, fleeing the capital city. So many capital city people fleeing the capital city.
Fled the city. So many people in the
This
capital.
only
During
Ganghwa Island, but capital city.
all over Korea, when the Koreans heard about the French landing in Ganghwa, they thought they were going to attack Seoul, and therefore they prepared for nationwide war. And immediately then the court sent out orders to collect rice and money and supplies and weapons and volunteer soldiers. There was a lot of excitement, and lots of Koreans were volunteering to go and fight the barbarians. It was quite a dramatic moment.
This is correct. Hanyang people freely the capital city, escaped, run away.
Yeah.
So many people, correct?
Most people.
They attacked the Ganghwa Island.
Yeah.
Hanyang. Different.
Yeah. But the French, they expected the French to attack the mainland. Yeah, that's what they expected. But they should have done, but they didn't. Yeah.
Attention.
Yeah.
No power. Government and military.
Yeah, the government.
Not attacking in Seoul, but it's attacking the invasion in Ganghwa Island.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's why You see, the Koreans celebrated the victory, but in fact there was no real conflict because the French suddenly just sailed away.
Yes, at the 45 days, 48 days, withdraw from Ganghwa Island.
Is that when they stole those books that we read? Is that time?
Yeah, that's the books.
But that's a bit of a loss.
Thank you.
200, how many is the Uyghur? 260?
Yeah.
300 volume. Not very many. But so there are lots of other things that they sent back. The most important thing for them was a big box full of silver. That was important. They took this big box of silver. This will pay for our expedition.
Is there any reason for the abrupt sudden withdrawal? Did they give any proper did he explain why they just suddenly decided to pack up and leave?
So why did they suddenly pack up and leave? Was an explanation.
Nobody, it's not clear really. Rose said, oh, winter is coming, the sea will soon be frozen. Nonsense, because the sea didn't freeze. He had no strong motivation to go on with this. He certainly didn't really have enough soldiers to attack and capture Seoul. He realized that. He reckoned there are several thousand. He would have to have several thousand soldiers and proper artillery and something quite different, bigger scale, and he didn't have it, and he couldn't have it. There weren't people in Asia. There weren't enough French people in Asia for them. So it's sort of, and that sort of disaster at Cheongdong-sa, which could have been a massacre if the Koreans had been better armed and had shot better, and then if they had come out after the French, then they would have fought all the French. There were 160 Frenchmen with very poorly armed, not wearing any kind of armor or anything. But the Koreans didn't come out. They stayed inside the fortress, Cheongdong-sa, allowing the French to go back. That was their mistake, if you like. But the French minister in Paris, when he got the report, he was furious because he said, this is so dangerous, so dangerous. You might easily have had a massacre. But Rose said, oh, no, that's he got off fairly lightly.
While we talk about the massacre at the temple, the Koreans seemed very reliant on gunpowder at that time. I thought gunpowder was used, like, developed during the Daedong Empire period.
Sorry.
Gunpowder weapons were more prevalent, like, in the later 1900s, early.
No, the Koreans had guns.
Yeah, I know they had it, but
they had cannon in the fortress, but they also had these arquebus, which are slow to, you have to reload each time. It takes a long time to reload, and they're not very effective, really.
the history of archery, they could have done better.
No, there's no record of that.
There's one question about the provenance of the contribution of the Catholics. Probably it's a very complicated issue, but if you know the ancestral worship as opposed to worshiping God and worshiping your fathers and so on, they didn't mesh well with the doctrine wise, and so there was this what should I call it, resistance from the Korean Yangban class, especially because even hypothetically, would it have been? I mean, it was not always like that. My understanding of the Jesuits was that they were quite accommodative to the local culture, and especially Matteo Ricci, he was very accommodating and respectful of the local culture, and trying best to go along. with the locality. And but at some point, the you know, you know, some order was issued that this should not be allowed. And so the question is, and now fast forward through the generations, now it is my belief in Catholic doctrine, it is allowed to worship your parents now in the early 20th century. So in this period of you know, hardcore fundamentalist, I don't know what to call it, but you know, doctrine, would it have been a major cause of this persecution?
At the highest level, scholars, both in China and in Korea, especially Neo-Confucian scholars, read books written in Chinese by mostly the Jesuit priests in China about Catholicism, about the Catholic view of God and man and nature and society. And they said, this is bad. They were on the basis of doctrine. But you see, the question of ancestor rights was quite complicated because the Jesuits, Maggiorinci and others, insisted that this was a civil ritual, not a religious ritual, because they were talking to high-class educated men who said, no, of course, you know, we're not feeding the spirits, we're not feeding ghosts. But other Catholic religious, Franciscan, Dominican and others, who were much closer to the ordinary people, heard the ordinary people all the time saying that they were feeding the ghosts. And these reports went back to Rome. And there was it's a very complicated issue, how in Europe, the image of China and of Confucianism, essentially the Chinese classics and Confucianism, went from interest and some sympathy and curiosity, went down through the 17th century after Ricci, and finally, early in the 18th century, the Pope decided that the Jesuits were wrong, that ancestor worship, soul tablets, food offerings were superstitious and were not allowed to Catholics. So it was forbidden for Catholics to celebrate these rituals.
But the Ten Commandment also says worship your parents.
It's not really worship, but it's a ritual for the deceased. And then in the earlier 20th century, sometime around 1920, the Pope said, oh, no, it's okay. The Chinese can make, or the Koreans can make offerings. It's not superstitious. It's not feeding ghosts. It's a family celebration, which is right. But for all that time, right through the 19th century, the 18th, 19th century, Catholics who wanted to remain Catholic had to get rid of the ancestor tablets, not make offerings, not do anything superstitious. So early on, after 1870, after 1880, 1890, a lot of the Yangban Catholics withdrew from the Catholic Church and said it's not possible. Offering the rites is too sacred and too deeply embedded in us. You have the Chongyak-yong, Dasan, and his brother, they both withdrew. Their other brother, Chongyak-jong, remained Catholic and was martyred. He's a saint. He's blessed. Yeah.
I've always been fascinated. This is a little bit out of your story, but you touched on it. I've always been fascinated by the story of Ernst Oppert, how he found the grave of Daedong Gun's father and took the bones from the tomb, and the grave wasn't in Seoul, it was somewhere, I think, on the coast.
Oh, it's right.
But I'm trying to imagine if a German person today got off the airplane at Incheon, speaking absolutely no Korean, and just sort of said, where can I find the grave of the father of today's president? It'd be almost impossible. Do we know anything more about how Oppert was able to do it? Did he have a Korean working for him?
Yeah, we know everything. He wrote it in great detail. His book, you must read his book. Great book. He's a very good writer. But you see, Oppert was accompanied by Father Féron, one of the three priests who escaped. And probably the idea of kidnapping the bones might have been from Father Féron. It was a Korean custom. Quite often, people would steal the bones of a young man's father and blackmail him with that. It wasn't a... But you see, Féron then mobilized some Catholics from nearby to lead them up to the tomb. But when they started digging, they struck rock. So they didn't find anything. And the local people started to attack them, and they had to retreat under fire. But not because this was the Daewon-gun's father. As a result of that stupid action, thousands of Catholics were massacred without trial from 1868 on. You no longer had to have a trial. You no longer even had to give a proper report. If they're Catholic, kill them.
To touch on that, I would like to ask, how long did it take for Christians as a whole stop being executed the way that, when did they start being treated better? Like, what was it a slow, did it progress slowly?
Sorry, go on.
How long was it before the Christians were no longer executed?
Quite quick. Yeah, I mean, some of the Koreans were stuck in prison for years. And the whole system was very messy. A Korean was not supposed to stay in prison. He was either exiled, executed, or sent home.
When did the persecution start to end?
Once Ko Jong took power, there were, I think, virtually no more executions that I know of. It was the Daewon-gun, who was a very wicked man, very terrible man, who thought he could keep the foreigners out and free Korea of that religion completely. He really wanted to wipe it out. But once he lost power, Ko Jong didn't like this because he was, they were negotiating with Japan. He knew Japan had already accepted Christianity. But it didn't really become free until the 1887, 1886. The treaties, well, American treaty 82, but it didn't immediately apply to Christianity. The French treaty also originally didn't mention the church, and then they said, so they added that. It's from 1887 that Bishop Blanc could come out of hiding. And in 1887 or 1888, he bought the land where Myeongdong Cathedral now stands as the center for a liberated church. And before that, there were 2 or 3 priests hiding in Korea. I say Riedel was in there, and he was arrested and kicked out. And he was kicked out because the government in China and in Japan told Korea, don't touch him. Let him, send him out, but don't hurt him. So it's beginning.